Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Psychedelics Today for our Solidarity Friday episode. Today is March 19th recording. And when you're listening, it's going to be, March. We're in May. Dude, COVID time and my brain with all the computer is starting to fry out. So this is May 21st.
Yes.
And my dyslexia is kicking in and I'm just thinking March, May. All right, welcome everybody. We're really excited to have our guests Elan Hagens and Rebecca Martinez here from the Fruiting Bodies Collective. But before we introduce them, just a reminder, by the time you're listening to this, Navigating Psychedelics has already kicked off. So check out our July courses. We have some dates up for July and September. So if you missed this round, check us out, psychedeliceducationcenter.com. And if you want to get a feel for what we're doing over there, you can sign up for some of the free courses. And yeah, that little pitch for Navigating Psychedelics. So we'll kick things off. Welcome, Elan and Rebecca. Do you want to give a little intro, who you are and what you're up to? And I guess we'll start with Rebecca.
Sure. Thanks so much for having us. We obviously are big fans of Psychedelics Today, and you all have accompanied me on many, many long drives. So it's really fun to be on the inside now and awesome. Kind of see what goes into making it. So my name's Rebecca Martinez. I am a Portland born and raised Chicana parent, educator, writer, and community organizer. My son's actually in the other room right now playing with pipe cleaners, so you might hear from him. I'm also one of the co-founders of Fruiting Bodies, which I'm sure we'll get to dive into a whole bunch here today. But just a little bit about how I ended up here. I grew up in a very conservative kind of religious environment, which I know is not totally uncommon for folks who have found their way to psychedelic healing. There's some sort of synchronicity there with that. And I think part of my own curiosity was spurred because things were so restricted growing up. So as I got through my teen years and into adulthood, I went from working on organic farms to organic cannabis farms, and then through just a series of transformative personal events, got into deep relationship with psilocybin mushrooms. So it became this kind of like natural evolution as things began to buzz in Oregon. And it went from being a kind of pie in the sky idea that we were hearing little bits and pieces about, that, oh, there's this group of therapists that are wanting to pass legal psilocybin therapy, to next thing we knew, it was just kind of coming up all the time, and I was in orbit with a lot of the folks who were working on it. So I ended up working as the event and volunteer coordinator in early 2020 for the Measure 109 campaign. And we can share a little bit about how Fruiting Bodies came to be outside of that, but that's just a little background about who I am and how I ended up here.
Cool. Thank you so much. And Elan?
And my name is Elan Hagens, and I am also born and raised in Portland, Oregon area. I've lived here for 37 years now, and I'm like learning to love my state even more and more every day. One of the biggest things with me is that I've been like a lifelong lover of the outdoors and nature and animals and all things encompassing that. That's what drives me, along with my love for like outdoor art. And so one of the things that this has led me to, this love, has been, I created a business called Temptus Truffles over a decade ago. So professionally, I've been doing outdoor education, particularly with mycology and mushrooms. I teach people how to truffle hunt, and I specialize in taking dogs out and doing all the things that involves dogs and food and community and crafts. And also a big part of my focus is food justice and teaching people about diversifying the outdoors, diversifying art, diversifying everything has been a big part of everything that I do, because I'm a Black woman in one of the whitest states in Oregon, in the country. And so, being that, people have obviously like hired me and had me teach like DEI work within the state, because what you don't really see people like me who are in outdoors here. Actually, you don't see people like me anywhere because of representation and lack thereof. So I have a business selling wild edibles as my mainstay, and I have a business at the farmer's market. So that's how I got hooked up with Becca, was through a mutual friend who had a farm business, and one night said, hey, meet my friends. Let's have like a good little farm dinner. And that was 6 years ago. And so that's been an organic relationship between Becca and I, just to have this friendship background and to have this love for nature. And so when Becca started working with the 109 campaign, it was obviously something that was like so natural because I've already been doing the mushroom thing, but not on a psychedelic level. I'm definitely all about public health education. That's a big part of my studies. And so to have the opportunity to have, psychedelics or psilocybin especially part of our public health structure, it made me so happy, and so happy to know that one of my good friends was involving herself in that as well. And so when 109 passed, it was just like, well, everybody's been contacting us and people want to know more about us and know more about what we've been learning and sharing with the public. And so that is basically kind of like how Fruiting Bodies got started. It was like it was just us two in a collective. And how our collective kind of also got jump started was because there's people who in our community had seen what we did and was like, hey, like they were talking to Becca about me and not knowing that we were friends, and then vice versa. And then we're like, we know each other. And we were like low key have been like doing this for a while now. So it's really nice that other people were seeing what we had been doing in our work. And with Fruiting Bodies, we were like, okay, we know that all there are right now is older, richer type of white males out there representing all of psychedelics, all of everything. It's like, when I talk about a lot of things, it's not only about psychedelics, because the mushroom is like the teeniest little part of it. Honestly, it's the teeniest part of it. We're talking about everything surrounding it. And so with that being said, like, oh my gosh, with Fruiting Bodies, one of the biggest things that we wanted to do was storytell and share the voices of people, not just who have had the privilege of traveling all over the world and have had the privilege of being able to have had the privilege of feeling safe, to be able to do these kind of experiences without, me. For example, for me, I just probably wouldn't do any psychedelics because I have a valid fear of getting arrested and going to jail.
Yeah.
I live in an area where during a march, I think 70% of the Black women and men had raised their hand when asked if they had just been casually pulled over. So those are the kind of pressures that surround a lot of people in our community. And it's not just Black people. It's like people who have disabilities are discriminated on. People who are considered overweight are discriminated on. There's so many poor, like we could just like get down to it. So one of the things with starting Fruiting Bodies, we're like, we have to have these voices who are people who are not just in psychedelics, but people who are going to benefit from psychedelics, people who don't know about psychedelics because a lot of people don't know about it. Right now, we're all talking to each other because we all know about the benefits of it. But we talked about how are we going to get this message out in a way where it's digestible, where we can listen to what our community members want when we hear their stories, or when we hear, hey, why did you vote for 109? You know nothing about psychedelics or psilocybin, but why did you vote for 109? And what are you hoping to get out of this measure here in Oregon? Or just what are you hoping to see in psychedelic medicine as a whole, not just in Oregon, just as a whole? Because when we see this kind of information, this information is the voices of people who haven't been heard. And by sharing these stories, we're able to kind of like take notes and put it down. And that's what's really nice to have. And so with that, our podcast came, and like the podcast is so good. Like me being at the farmer's market this season after I was starting the podcast I wish everybody could be in my shoes just to hear our audience, our community, the things that makes them smile, the things that make them sad that you never knew. The people who have started microdosing for the first time in their lives, maybe because they, saw something from you guys, maybe they saw something from us and got a pamphlet, but the feedback that I've heard has been like literally make me cry like every other day. And that's like the beauty of it. And that comes back to a lot of the things that I'm interacting with, which is nature. And when we're doing this kind of work, we always have to we need to come back and realize that this stuff came from soil. It's not just a pill. It can be a pill, and everybody can have medicine in their own way. But we need to know that we need to acknowledge all these variables within it, and especially indigenous healing and indigenous medicine. Giving like reverence to that and acknowledging that every chance it comes up in your mind, talk about it. Don't be, we've talked about it too much. Every time it comes up in your mind, let's talk about it more, because the more we talk about these kind of things, the more it's not going to be like on some kind of spectrum kind of thing. It's going to be what we know, what we expect.
True.
And so, yeah, I could go on, obviously. Let me stop talking.
No.
Becca?
No, thank you so much, Elan. That's amazing. No, I really appreciate it. Your voice, both of you, so important. I'm so glad you're doing what you're doing. I was thinking for the audience, maybe we back up just a little and like before we even get to like what other projects Fruiting Bodies are involved in, could we just like define what Measure 109 is for folks and what it did in Oregon real quick?
Becca, you should definitely talk about
Either
that.
of you.
Sure. Yeah, happy to. So Measure 109 is an unprecedented measure. It's the first statewide measure that created a legal framework for psilocybin-assisted therapy. So essentially, right now, Oregon passed it in November, and so now we're in the midst of a 2-year development period. So that means we have a large state committee, which basically is in charge of compiling research, going through a rulemaking process. And that's mostly comprised of a lot of neuroscientists and doctors and folks who work in public health. And then there are several subcommittees focused on training, research, products, licensing, and health equity. And Elan and myself serve on the health equity subcommittee, which we're very excited about. It's just getting started. But so we have a 1.5 years now. All of these subcommittees are kind of working together to focus on these different arenas because it's such an unprecedented measure. And so the way it looks is in early 2023, the state of Oregon, through the Oregon Health Authority, will be able to start accepting applications for licenses. And those licenses can involve clinics who, whether it's a freestanding clinic already that's a mental health facility or a hospital, or someone wants to create a clinic specially for psilocybin sessions, people can apply to do that. You could apply as a facilitator. So if you want to be the person who actually sits in sessions, you have to undergo a special training to do that. Or you can apply as a grower and transporter. And so if you're passionate about growing mushrooms, that's another avenue. So that's kind of in a nutshell what's going on in Oregon. The one tricky thing is that because it's been called psilocybin therapy throughout the whole campaign, there's just so much public confusion around who is going to be allowed to be a facilitator, who needs to, do people need a diagnosis? That's one thing we try to let people know all the time is you don't need a diagnosis in order to go access psilocybin treatment in Oregon. And so that's kind of a radical model. It's very different than what's happening at like the federal level with psilocybin. And the other piece is just really this attempt to not overly medicalize the use of psilocybin. And so we're straddling that line. It's a constant part of the conversation in Oregon with a lot of the leadership is like, how do we convey that this is a healing modality and yet it's not strictly medical? And yet we're also not talking about just adult use free for all at home. So there's really nothing like it, for better or worse. We're kind of finding our way through the dark.
No, absolutely. I really appreciate you laying that out. I think it's helpful for folks as we just move into the nitty-gritty of what you guys are doing and why it's so important. So yeah, let's lay out all the avenues that Fruiting Bodies Collective is involved in. Elan started to touch on it and why it was necessary and the podcast, but you guys are way more than a podcast, right? Could you tell
Absolutely.
us what the Fruiting Bodies Collective is and why is it so important to have in Oregon?
Oh my gosh. Yeah. Like the podcast obviously that was our first little step of saying, hey, telling our community that, hey, we're here and we want you. And so that was like the big step that definitely was what got us even more information. And the information that we have received about is that people want to have a spot, no matter what, people want to have a spot for their voice, and maybe not on a podcast, maybe on a forum. And so that's one thing that we are in the future hoping to, compile together. We know moderating forums and having people share information is something that is necessary, because then you only have the certain people who can shout the loudest, who has the most, money to put themselves forth. Those are the only people who are going to get, unfortunately, respect, because that's how we are used to seeing, is like the people who are shouting have the most knowledge for some reason. So we want a community-run collective where people who want to become facilitators can have the kind of information about the places they can go for training. That's one of the biggest things that we at Fruiting Bodies have received, is that people want to be facilitators, but they just don't know where to go. And so we were like, hey, you know what? We got to do something about that. We definitely have to do something about that. And so Fruiting Bodies has expanded to definitely teaching people more and more about this movement. And I think Becca should definitely talk about we do have a big step that we have been called to do by our community and to take on because of the big feedback that we've received. And that is having a facilitator course of our own, and not of our own, but our own being ran by our community, taught by our community, not just two people who have had the privilege of traveling the world and saying they're the best shamans in the world. We are having, I know. It's true. And because that's or people who can just sit with the tribe or any kind of group and have the ability to sit there and write a course from all the information that they have, let's be honest, stolen. We are not that. That is one thing that we are going to press over and over and over again. We want to make sure that everybody has access, and part of equity and inclusivity and all that is ownership and being able to contribute. So I know I could go on and on, but Becca, I want her to talk more about this because she's definitely been one of the pushers behind let's do this, because I need somebody like her to motivate me and vice versa. So definitely, you want to talk about our plans?
Yeah. Thanks, Elan. Yeah, we definitely, Elan's like the roots in the soil and I'm like the rushing water. And we're like constantly trying to balance each other out. To kind of summarize what Elan so beautifully shared, we are creating a collectively owned psychedelic peer support training program that is infused with messages and teachings around healing justice. And so instead of having a cool course that teaches you about psychedelic trip sitting and then having a unit about equity, it's really going to be infused into the whole paradigm. So every aspect of what we talk about, whether it's Indigenous history or sitting with people from different spiritualities, or the war on drugs and why that's relevant, to unpacking internal bias so that you can safely sit with someone who's a different gender identity or race or religion from you. It's just something that we are so passionate about, because in our own immediate experiences, we have found that the people who are the best facilitators are those who are really good at getting out of the way. And what we know culturally is there's so much more work to do to get out of the way than just knowing how to say the right things and hold someone's hand. It's really about what you're bringing, consciously or not, to that exchange. And so we're in collaboration with about a dozen of our just like absolute dream team contributors, people who are psychedelic therapists and trainers, people who are somatic practitioners, people who work in racial trauma and racial justice, people from MAPS and CIIS. Like, it's really, we like laid out the dream team. And then one by one over the last few months, people have started just popping into our inbox saying, hey, we should connect. And we're like, actually, you're on our list of someone we want to reach out to because we want you to be a co-owner of this project. And so that's part of what we're really excited about is we're just turning the model on its head. And instead of saying, here's this hierarchical tower where these two people are the experts and they have a team, and then we have the teachers and instructors and there's the students, we're saying, what if it's this circle that we understand that our knowledge and wisdom and ways of knowing are more than the sum of their parts. And if we all create this together and it's actually owned by the contributors as well and really like facilitated by fruiting bodies, but we're really here as like the drivers to help compile the content, interview the educators, help produce the videos, promote it, and get it out to people. That's our next big project. And so I'm just really excited because we get to learn. You know, a lot of why we came into this was hearing so many accounts of folks who have gone through trainings that are really reputable and still felt some pretty major gaps with where they ended up afterwards and what they still felt was so needed. And so we thought, okay, this could be supplemental for a lot of folks who have already gone through great trainings and are wanting more. And it can also be the starting point for folks like us who were saying, what kind of training would I want? And what are the things that we need to go deeper that we haven't gone deep enough yet in some of these other trainings? And so I'm excited just for the relationships that are being forged. And I think a lot of what we've talked about is the need to be collaborating across disciplines, because we are sort of in this echo chamber in psychedelics and we're hearing from the same voices. And I'm like, okay, well, we're straddling some different worlds here. And so what if we bring folks who work in transformative justice and folks who work in community outreach and help introduce their insights and wisdom into psychedelics, and then help create opportunities for those groups who work in the community to access psychedelics in Oregon. So there's just more bridge building going on. And I think that's at the heart of what we're creating. So all that to say, we've totally cleared our schedule for June, because we're not going to do any outward facing projects. We're going to be focused solely on like building our roadmap for the rest of the year. We received a small grant from Dr. Bronner's to get started. And so we're going to be actively fundraising to multiply that $10,000 into about $100,000. So we're going to be taking on sponsors. So if anyone listening wants to get involved, there's lots of ways they can get involved, but that's kind of the vision. And now it's actually in motion. It's happening.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Congratulations. Sounds really, really exciting. And I guess like a technical question that keeps popping up in my head, just talking about training, I guess you don't really know what that looks like with Measure 109, but how do you see that kind of like integrating into maybe their requirements when that starts to unfold? Because I think this is a question a lot of people have, wanting to get involved in trainings. Like, okay, go through this. What's the next step? And I mean, it sounds like you guys probably have some cool insights there. So maybe able to kind of craft the program around what's going on there with Measure 109.
Definitely. And that's part of the benefit and the drawback of being so close on the inside, is that we do have direct access to information as soon as it's coming out. And so it's also our role to try and help get that out to other folks who are like us, because we know we can't and don't want to be the only ones. So one misconception that folks had in Oregon was that the state was going to have one training program that was sort of run by the Oregon Health Authority. And that's never been the case. It's just never really been talked about for whatever reason. And so once we started kind of working our way up the ladder, so to speak, and asking questions, and several mentors and leaders said, well, do you guys want to create a training program? And we were like, we can. and then they laid out for us that it's private groups, it's private companies. Like, let's be honest. I mean, we could call them an organization. There's a lot of big leaders. It's private groups. And so basically, the training subcommittee is working to define what elements need to be included within a training. Like, here are the parameters, here's the outlines, and then groups can come and say, here's how we're demonstrating that we're going to cover these things comprehensively. And there will be certain requirements for these groups. And I'm not totally clear on what the vetting process will be. And so we know the end of July, the training subcommittee will have to come out with those requirements. And also all of the training subcommittees meetings are available on Oregon.gov. And I'm happy to share the link with you guys if you want to put it in the show notes, because it's really, really important for folks. Anyone can tune in and watch the live Zoom calls, and they're all recorded. So you can go back and watch and get caught up on everything that's been done so far.
Awesome. That's super important. I didn't realize that. That is very good to know. You used a phrase before, peer support. And, this is something that I wanted to ask you about and just like clear the record kind of for, what kind of folks can become facilitators in Oregon, right? It's kind of unique where, from my understanding, you don't actually have to be like a licensed therapist. Is that true? And can you talk to us about, like who can enroll in these training programs?
Sure. Yeah. Elan, do you feel good with me answering this? I feel like I'm taking all this airtime.
I'll talk a little bit about that. You'll chat.
Okay.
One of the biggest things when we talk about things like diagnoses and of mental illnesses or just talk about mental illnesses and like who's allowed to give these kind of things, we always are going to come back to, okay, there is a privilege in being able to go to school and having a doctorate. There's a privilege in having a parent who can support you in elementary school to get you and have enough money to get you into college. But that does not mean that there are people who have not had all these degrees and stuff, that they do not have the same type of knowledge. And so and especially with psychedelic medicine, I'm always going to come back. Let's come back to the indigenous wisdom. There are no doctorates in there. There's no titles in there. And so we always want to talk about that when it comes down to that, because that would separate a lot of people, especially in Oregon. The demographics of African Americans being doctors in the state and having these positions of power are almost non-existent, not just to the large amount of racism. So to exclude that would actually be excluding me from even wanting to get treatment, because I would know that the only person probably out there who would be able to provide treatment for me would be a white person who has had the privilege of having multiple degrees. And so we always want to come back to that. And with any kind of training, with any of this, we want to come back and give respect to the indigenous people and their knowledge, and the knowledge that has been taken and the land that has been taken and then put into doctorate terms so people can set themselves above each other. And so with that being said, I love that Oregon. That is why I am part of this, because I would not be part of this if there was only therapists and doctors allowed to do this. And so when this was passed, that was one of the big things that the community loved hearing and loved knowing, that you don't have to have a bunch of money. So and Becca can elaborate more and more about how not anybody can be a therapist, but anybody can be not a therapist, but a facilitator, guide, trip sitter. We don't know the exact terms that are going to be used right now.
Cool.
Yeah, and the terms are really important too. And I think that's part of the work we have to do, is kind of distinguishing these very different avenues. And part of the weakness in 109 is that we've created this huge kind of blanket thing that encompasses many different aspects of using psilocybin, and those things haven't clearly been sussed out yet. And so part of what we're trying to help do is create a couple of clear lanes, because as Elan spoke on, this is really a health equity issue, because we have to have representation in leadership if we're going to have an equitable program. We just have to. We have to have queer folks. We have to have folks who have certain disabilities, folks from marginalized communities, from all income brackets. It's just absolutely essential. And I, at the same time, hearing that, and I worked on the campaign training volunteers and teaching them how to talk with the public about this. And part of it was learning what concerns the public had. And so the question we heard a lot was, okay, wait, in this measure, it just says the only built-in requirement is you have to have a high school diploma. Like, what does that mean? Like, can anyone just, get a license and go start giving out mushrooms? And the fear is built in for many reasons, culturally and stigma. There's a lot to overcome anyway. And so as we've been talking about this therapeutic model, a lot of the language has kind of shifted towards this medicalization. And even if you look at the makeup of the board, it's a very medicalized community. And so we're kind of trying to hold this other voice, which is it's not one or the other, because if you have complex post-traumatic stress disorder, or if you are dealing with some psychiatric conditions and looking for support, and you've seen the documentaries and read the articles, you're going to want someone who has specific training in therapy, counseling, psychiatry, who is familiar with your case and has the capacity and skill set to work with you. At the same time, if you're coming in because you want to do some personal exploration and healing just in life in general, this isn't to say that repressed memories and trauma and things can't come up. But what you need as a facilitator is going to be a different skill set. And a lot of it has to do with knowing your own scope of practice and knowing what's beyond your scope and being able to screen to be a good match with someone coming in. And that's why we call these people clients. If they're coming in, you're sitting with them for a session. It's not a treatment. It's not therapy. You're there to hold space for them. A lot of it has to do with setting expectations, and so we're really using the framework of psychedelic peer support. And what I hope we will do in Oregon is kind of create these two tracks, which is helping folks who are coming into this, they're going to be coming from all over, not just in Oregon, people who are funneling in and seeking an experience with psilocybin for a multitude of reasons, and helping direct them, okay, this is your circumstances. You should go, here's this database of clinics and facilitators that are going to be really well suited for you. Okay, you're looking to explore, or you want like a retreat type environment. We'll direct you this way, and here's some folks you can rely on. And so a lot of it's going to be on us to help guide and not handhold or control the situation, but help people understand that this is an expansive body of practice that we've lumped into one thing, and we're calling it psilocybin therapy. So I'm really working with the language, because it's not just about the language, it's about what messages you're conveying with the language and what expectations you're setting up people with. So I think that's kind of why especially as we're not therapists. Elon's background is in Black studies and public health. My degree is in spiritual leadership. So we're not therapists or psychiatrists. And at the same time, a lot of the folks who we're working with on this training, they train other facilitators. That's what they do for a living. But we don't want to set it up so that we're not trying to create therapists at the end of this training. Like, if you want to be a therapist, you need to go become a therapist, And I think that's really important for people to kind of get clear on, is this is not an alternative. This is a very different path. And the employment opportunities and career path, there's a lot that's still unknown, So as people choose of how they want to invest in their education and training, those are things they have to think about.
Thank you so much. Yeah, that's so interesting. And I really appreciate you explaining that, both of you. I think that's really helpful to think about this moving forward, for sure. I wonder, Kyle, do you have any questions on that as a therapist, or should we move on to some other topics?
I had a lot of stuff firing, and Elan, I'm just grateful that you brought up this topic of privilege to be a therapist. This is something I've come back to pretty often, of say, like, these archetypal energies that a lot of people embody. There's a lot of people that step into these professions maybe for the prestige, or they have the privilege to be able to do that. And how many healers out there could actually be really great healers, but they didn't have the privilege to step into that because of financial barriers. I think it's something I've always kind of struggled with too, of like, do I want to engage in that? Okay, it's beneficial. So I went down that route, and I was able to, have support by the family, but also took out massive amounts of debt. And I'm just like, what is this? And it kind of gives me a headache. And when I hear some therapists and medical professionals, and there are some in the field that are like, well, I did it, so you should do it. And I scratch my head and go, well, what's your privilege there? Does everybody have, the resources to go to med school to do this? Answer is no. And I really love that you brought that up. And I think it's important that we have to keep coming back to it, because what is mental health? And what are the ways forward? I worked at a peer support residence treatment center, and I saw really great benefit. I mean, I saw some of the cons of peer support as well, but it was really beneficial. And to say that, hey, you didn't like have the privilege to go through all this training, so you're not qualified to help people, makes me kind of scratch my head and go, well, maybe we need to start reconsidering what these professions are and how to really approach health and wellness. So I don't know. Yeah, I'm on that edge too.
One little
people.
thing I would love to add.
Maybe not sorry.
No, we love it.
Please.
I was in a conversation recently with a trusted friend who's, somewhat well known in the field. And we got in this discussion about this difference between, psychedelic therapy and psychedelic peer support and the need for both. And, I was kind of making the argument like, okay, if we're talking about a $10,000 10-month program for people to become a facilitator in Oregon, which is something that's been put forth, I was asking, like, what exactly are we covering in that 10 months and that $10,000? And who decided that it's going to be $10,000? And are people calling that affordable? And who's defining what affordability means? Because it's really, really important to have the right voices at the table. And if we're talking about you need to go full-time school, stop your life, don't be working. Look, my child walked out during this podcast. Like, what are you going to tell the single parents who would actually be great facilitators, but need to be able to study on nights and weekends, need to have more fluidity, need to be able to pay on sliding scale or pay what you can. Like, there are so many other ways to create diversity. And it's not just diversity for the sake of diversity. It's diversity for the sake of representation and community healing. So we can heal together with folks who understand our lived experiences. So we're going to drive it home again and again. But one issue I've seen with the therapists in my life is, as you mentioned, Kyle, like having gone through the years and the debt and the labor that you've gone through to get to where you are, a couple of the therapists in my life, there's almost this sense, and tell me if I'm wrong because I know y'all are not a monolith, but there's almost this sense of like, I worked so hard to get here to be able to do this, and now the state wants to make it super easy so y'all can spend a year studying and then you can sit with people. Like, that's not fair. Like, you should have to suffer like I suffered, And granted, I think there's much more to the conversation. And what he said was like, well, Becca, you might be diminishing everything that can come up during a psilocybin session. And so I guess I would love to hear, your take on that, because I feel like I could see it both ways,
Yeah, it's really interesting, and I've really kind of sat with this myself. I remember when I was at my intern site, there was all this discussion about like coaching, and some of the people kind of had it out for coaches because it's like, wait, I went through all this training, we're governed by a board, and they're making more money than us, and I had to go through all this rigorous training, and what the hell's going on here? And to some degree, I get that jealousy too of like, oh, wow, like I could be doing lots of different things outside the scope, not dealing with the board that gives me a headache, and kind of limiting different things versus like being in an unregulated market where you can kind of maybe show up more as yourself. And there's something appealing to that. But I think I'll take it back to like breathwork training. When people ask us about like, oh, how long is a breathwork training? I say, a minimum of like 2 years is what we're thinking for our training with our teachers at Dream Shadow. And I mean, when I really think about it, I didn't start facilitating a workshop until maybe 3 or 4 years in. And there is something about having long-term in-depth, rigorous training with whatever you're doing. So, having that training, with grad school, having an internship, some of the theoretical stuff, I mean, I wouldn't say prepared me for the field. I think, can we develop new models that gives more hands-on experience, more practical experience? We're able to learn these skills without the massive amount of debt. Why do you need to have all these programs that are very expensive? You learn a bunch of theoretical stuff that half the time, I don't know, from my experience, didn't really teach me, a lot of things at times. And, in my program, I focus on somatics, and, we only had like a few classes on trauma approaches, and I was in the somatic lens, so trauma informed approaches is definitely heavy in the somatics, but within that like K-CREP curriculum, there's not much trauma focus on there. And I scratch my head and go, what are these programs teaching at times to really work with people? I don't know. That's a little bit of my critique, I guess.
No, it's so important.
I don't know how other therapists feel, but
I appreciate this conversation so much. I think it's putting so much into perspective, and I just think, all of you, Kyle, Rebecca, and Elan, like, I think that's so interesting and such a good way to think about it moving forward, because Oregon really is, kind of setting this foundation for if psilocybin-assisted therapy or, any kind of psychedelic healing modality, if it does, move beyond the borders of Oregon State, I think just like with cannabis legalization, everyone's going to be looking to you guys as a model, right? And so it's really important to try to get this stuff first and get this stuff right first. Make sure there is representation, not just for diversity's sake, having like token people of color on the board just to look like you're a progressive board. Like, no, it's about making everyone in the community feel like they can go to these places, they can feel comfortable, they can let their boundaries down. Yeah. Psilocybin is a very intense medicine sometimes. You're very vulnerable, right? And if you can't feel like you can be yourself in front of your facilitator, that's like such a good recipe for a bad trip. Like, so I just think it's so important. And I guess, I wanted to hear your thoughts on this. Like, why is it? I mean, besides what I have been just spewing, like, what else do you guys see as, like, it might be a lot of pressure, but like, why is it so important to get this stuff right in Oregon?
Yeah, in Oregon, just like you said, we're doing something that has not been done, and we're hoping to get it done, obviously, in a way where everybody in the world can look to us. And so we can have, our goal is to have like a bunch of fruiting bodies, not saying it has to be fruiting bodies collective, but we want 1 million fruiting bodies. Like we know because of our community feedback that this is a way we need to go. We need to go away from like hey, I need to have the money to go to my insurance. I need to, first of all, have insurance. Hello, nobody has insurance. So like can we talk about like, there's a diagnosis, but like, what if you don't even have medical insurance? What if you have none of that? We're not even going to get we're not going to get to the healing part. We're not even going to get to the integration. None of that's going to happen because we all know there is a lack of health insurance. And that's been brought up a couple times in some of our discussions. And actually the even word insurance like makes me like, get away from that, because that's the big part of accessibility. And so with us, we are like, there's no way that we're going to talk about any of these things without like the base roots. And that's like, let's act like we all have no money right now, and that I feel like something needs to change. Like, let's just start there. And then with our community, people have been approaching us not just for information about like psilocybin, but when I was talking about our podcast, it's about the integration that happens before. We are talking about people who have housing issues. We are talking about general health issues, because if you don't feel good in your body, that's going to go to your mind. And sometimes when those kind of things get all mixed up, you don't know if it's a mental thing or if it's a physical thing, what chicken or the egg, what came first. But if there's a road that maybe is bringing you to the mushrooms for some kind of healing, we want to always say, hey, it's not just the mushroom. Like maybe we can point you into a direction of giving some low cost or free gym memberships. Maybe I can point you to somebody who deals with housing. Maybe we can get you set up with some food from the farmer's market where Becca and I originally started this journey, because that is part of it. Always say, hey, you can't go in, get a session and go home and eat Cheetos and have a bunch of crappy roommates, because you're not going to continue to get that kind of like that healing that happens before post and, before pre and post. And I remember you just saying something about like, yeah, a lot of people are going to go in and get treatments. And, especially with your schooling, you were saying a lot of it is like all the talk and the stuff that you may not be using, immediately. But with Fruiting Bodies, one of the things, even with our course, we're going to make sure that this isn't a one time in and out and you get to just go on your own. You need to be constantly learning. You need to be constantly not constantly checking in, but as a representation of us, I know Becca and I and our community, we want to make sure that everybody, including me, is continuing to do the work. And so that was one thing you were talking about earlier. Like, so I just wanted to say, like, yeah, we want to make sure that people have options before, during, after, 5 years from now. Like,
Super
you can
important.
come to us, and 5 years from now, if somebody has had a fruiting bodies licensure or certification, we are going to like still continue to uplift and still continue to make sure that they are in an equitable system and that they are doing what they dreamed of. And that's one thing I ask everybody. I'm like, hey, what are your dreams? And people sometimes tell us and what they want. It could be, I want to stay in a year. I'm like, cool. I'm going to talk to some people. And then when I think of, if I hear there's a year, I'm going to go right back to you. And that's just all about resources and connecting and that mycelial, that web just spreading around and more than just eating something physically and changing.
Yeah. I guess on this topic of like medicalization, I don't know. I always come back to like these different use cases, right? We need it all, right? And so not to completely shit talk on the therapy medicalization route or this is better than this. We all need everything. But I wonder what some of your thoughts are with the recent kind of like opposition with Compass trying to maybe, wrote that letter to Oregon and saying, hey, what's going on here? I guess what are some of your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I'm happy to chime in. I think it was right after our first podcast launched that David Bronner had posted his blog and, kind of raised the flag about Compass. And it's amazing how these things can completely derail us. And when we have a perception of groups being really big and powerful, we almost like hand them their power. And so it's almost like, do they have as much influence and sway as we perceive? Or is that part of how they get more influence and sway is by the posturing, And so part of like what some of our mentors had to talk us through, because that was one of the first blogs, is I did a live that night and we talked through a lot of the questions and concerns people had is like, wait, can folks who are trying to medicalize this, like, can they undermine what's happening in 109? Like, is there even a route to this? And so we had to start asking really good questions. And we got to this kind of end, which was like, no, they can't. Like, it's a lot of like smoke and mirrors and like the legal processes that would be required to like, I don't even know, I'm not a lawyer, to withdraw something that the American voters voted in. Like, that's not how it works, And so it's much more subtle of this desire to like undermine and create distrust in this model and basically kind of convey this idea that it wouldn't be safe because it hasn't passed through the FDA and through like clinical trials. And then, Compass did come out more recently and said, no, we're not, like, we respect what the Oregon voters have said. Here's our stance, And at the end of the day, where we've come to is like, the more energy that we spend on our no and like on resisting and talking about, and not to say we shouldn't talk about it because we need to address these concerns. Absolutely. But the more we do that, the more it just drains and sucks our energy out of us. And it's like, then we can't really focus on our yes, which is like, what do we want to build instead or in addition? And it's not necessarily about opposition, but like, how do we create some counterbalance so that people do know that there are options? And when we talk about Oregon, that's why we're trying to move at a healthy, kind of fast clip at fruiting bodies. We wish we didn't have to, but we want to come out with the first batch of leaders and trainers to say, hey, here are some other options straight out of the gate, so that the tone that has been set is one of equity and access, and it creates healthy peer pressure so that folks are like, wait, do you have a BIPOC scholarship fund? Do you have an Indigenous reciprocity fund? If not, why not? You all are talking about scale, which means you're talking about big numbers. And we see these little groups that are putting X% of their profits. So why aren't you guys? And that's the kind of healthy conversation that we want. And so those are things that can create a precedent that other states can follow. And if we don't do that proactively at the start, it's much harder to go back and undo these kind of power structures that have just kind of made their way in like they did in cannabis. So I think there's a lot more proactivity, at least in like these kind of grassroots organizations. But at the same time, a lot remains to be decided. So.
Yes, no, so important. I appreciate you explaining that for sure. There was another, question I had. There was, Elon used a phrase in the beginning of the podcast about feeling safe. And I think it's really important and something I wanted to talk about while we are talking about, legalizing psychedelics or just using psychedelics actually more. And, I wanted to ask you guys about, drug policy reform and how can we help all different kinds of communities feel safe using psychedelics or even talking about them. And I wonder what you guys are doing. I know you guys are doing a lot of education work. And if you could just speak to this point a little bit, I'd really appreciate it.
Yeah. In the beginning, I'm glad you brought that back up again, because that right there, the using, the holding, the talking about it, what is it? That was hard for me to want to involve myself because like I said, the safety. And so with safety, it's not only, a lot of times people think harm reduction and safe spaces have to only do with physically digesting something. And Beck and I are always talking about no. There's much more about safety and safe spaces and harm reduction, what you're doing than the physical, just the psilocybin or the DMT or whatever it is we were talking about. And so that's hard because we're talking about years and years and years of oppression and unlearning and all these stigmas. And during this process, I've been so triggered. Becca's been so triggered. We have been crying about certain things. I have personally said, oh my gosh, me involving right now, and it's a fact, I'm involving myself as a Black woman with psilocybin therapy. So I right now am giving out the message to other Black and brown and minorities that this is okay. What I always have to press all the time is yes, we have a lot of trauma. I am hurting every damn day. But I want, when I go into wanting to get some kind of, whether it be an experience, whether it be just a walk in the woods, I am very careful about how I get there because of the steps that could get me in jail. And I always go back to the jail thing because I've been in jail twice, or I've been arrested 4 times. Look at me. I can't even remember because it doesn't even, it's so, what's sad is it's so common and it doesn't even, I've worked through it, but it shouldn't be something where I can just talk about it, about being arrested and in jail. And it's always and some of the things I've been not involved in, drugs have been the root. And that is a really scary thing because I don't want another Black person to carry mushrooms in their pocket because they need a microdose that day. And then because I said it was okay and they weren't as careful or responsible, or they're in the East Coast and they found the tiniest bit and now they're locked up for 8 years. That really gets my heart all the time. And sometimes it made me in the beginning just want to be I can't deal with this at all. I can't even be associated with this because if I am responsible for anybody getting incarcerated or the wrong message, I can't live with myself kind of thing. And that's why Becca and I are so careful about how we approach it and how we always say, hey, we're straddling the underground with the above ground, because when you're above ground, you're telling everybody, hey, I'm out there, and you're underground, you get to kind of do things quiet, but you kind of don't, it keeps you you can, if you're underground, you can kind of find your group safely sometimes. But then there's not some of these rules and regulations that sometimes some people need exchange between each other. And so, I'm a happy person right now because I feel like more and more information that we keep getting out there and destigmatizing psychedelics, it makes me less shy. It makes me more confident. but does it mean that I'm tomorrow gonna carry mushrooms in my pocket and not fear that outside of my door that a police is not going to put my head on the ground, kick my ass, and arrest me? No, I'm not stupid. I know that vulnerability is always going to be there, and people who are providing need to know that too when they're providing. Not just, oh great, you need healing, I'm gonna give this to you. Like, you guys need to know the severity of it, the severity of when you are giving, if a client is getting some kind of treatment, and they're going to give the information to somebody else, you have to educate your client. I don't care what color they are. You have to educate them, black, brown, whatever. It's a stream that's going to have to keep going on and on. And good allyship, proper allyship is something we didn't really talk about, but it's necessity. It's essential. And with allyship, it's not just, hey, you've read these four books and you went to this talk on how to support Black and brown people and how to make things better for us, because it's still like a separatist thing where I'm going to come in and I'm going to help you because you need it, or I'm going to offer scholarships because it's actually going to bring in me saying that, oh, I'm going to offer scholarships for Black and brown people, even if you've done a little bit of the work. It's a posturing thing, no matter what. It's like any business looks kind of better in this day and age if you are saying all the lands that you're on, if you're doing all the pronouns, if you're offering BIPOC scholarship. But a lot of that is still performative. And so we are like, you have to do more than perform. You gotta talk the talk, you gotta walk the walk, you gotta take criticism, you gotta humble yourselves. I humble myself. I mean, it's a constant work and a constant emotional thing, but we'll find a balance. I know it's going to happen right now, like with the urgency that Becca said. There is an urgency, and I don't do urgency at all because I like to watch people and watch how they move before I actually put my heart and a thought into it. Because in the past, I've been drugging a dirt, or a lot of times if there's a situation where there's a brown person, a white person, if legal things come in, the white people, a lot of times just scatter away and hide back into the safety bubble of being white. But then they also get the privilege of being attached to a Black person when they're doing something good. And then we're just left, sitting there alone. So safety, I could go on and on forever. But Becca, you could add to that too. About allyship. I mean, Becca, she's helped me learn a lot because she is a white passing Latino. So people talk to her in ways that they will not talk to me. And I like that because sometimes people get comfortable. And we've always said people get comfortable. And I like that her experience as an ally is showing other people how to act, and also giving me information about how people act behind closed doors. Because I wouldn't act that way in front of me.
I hate to admit it. It's so true.
I have these wrinkles in my forehead and my eyebrows raise a lot, and it shuts people up. But if I'm not there, people kind of talk.
But no, thank you for just saying all of that. I really appreciate it. It takes a lot of freaking guts, and just thank you, Elan. But yeah, I would like to hear what you have to say about allyship for sure, Rebecca.
Yeah, God, Elan, I'm always just so astounded. I'm just like, we need more people like you sharing raw stories and making us all a little uncomfortable. It's like we're way too cozy sometimes in the psychedelic healing bubble. We need to be having these real conversations. And it's true. People have been astounded that we're a women-owned company that's run by a Black woman and a Latina woman, because they're like, wait, people don't often partner in this way, and it's going well, and y'all trust each other, and y'all have roots in friendship, and and we navigate things, because all the time I'm like, we might be in a meeting and people keep looking at me, and I'm like, hey, let's let Elan talk. She's the boss here. She knows more about this than I do. And so that constant having to track the power dynamics and the impacts of what's happening and what's not being said, or maybe not even being caught. I'm constantly learning. We have to have real talks. I'm like, hey, and sometimes I'm oversensitive, and you're like, Becca, don't be so woke. It's fine that you didn't introduce me on this podcast. Everyone knows I'm a co-host.
Or I talk over you. I was like, I don't even know.
We hold each other accountable. Yeah. Totally. You're like, we're fine. So I do think there's deeper things there, though, and a lot of what you already spoke on is it's about impact. We talk so much about intentions, and I know so many folks have nice intentions, and that really doesn't matter much. What matters is the downstream effects of your actions or your inactions or what you do say or what you don't say, and it's much harder to go towards those things because it's like, well, I feel misunderstood, or that wasn't what I meant by that thing. But it's like you said, we got to get so humble. And especially when we're talking about, these are very real, very serious things. And I've had some sketchy psychedelic experiences that turned out to be really formative and useful and healing that I wouldn't recommend for people. And so when I think about risk reduction, I'm not actually thinking so much about substances. And that's not to say that there aren't risks with mixing things. There absolutely are. People should be educated. But the risk that I think of is largely legal risk, policing, stigma in family, talking about jobs, child custody, those are very real things. And I think as much as it's great that we're talking about things. It's great that Instagram is a space where you can literally say anything about any drug use and nothing ever gets taken down. That's great, but it's not actually keeping in step with the laws. And so if we're not careful, we can create this false sense of security, especially when we start talking about access. Well, it's not just about access. Especially decrim nature, love them, hate them, whatever. When you're doing city-based changes that are really symbolic in nature, you're not actually changing the laws to protect people. And so I get really nervous when we start promoting things that don't actually make life easier for the folks who have been harmed by the war on drugs, And so I think as hard as it is, we have to have some level of restraint, in how we're promoting things and making sure that our promoting is in step with activism. Local activism, state level, definitely, because we have to have policy change in step with destigmatization.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. And that was actually a question that I wanted to raise. So I'm glad you kind of went there. And just this idea of safety. And I wonder what your future vision for drug policy is, right? Because we're talking about decriminalization. Decriminalization doesn't mean that it's safe, right? I'm thinking about New York City. Cannabis was decriminalized, but they still had stop and frisk, and large amounts of BIPAC people were getting arrested still, charged fines, even though it was decriminalized. And so, I worry about the same thing with this whole decriminalization movement. It's what do we need to really move towards? I know there's people that really lean towards decriminalization, and then others are, the legalization. But does legalization always mean legalization within the medical model? Or are there other models out there that you're kind of exploring? And what looks like it's starting to create a more holistic approach for safety and access and everything else?
So I was recently interviewing Anthony Johnson, who was the chief petitioner for Measure 110, actually for you all, for an article that will come out, I'm sure, before too long. And part of our conversation led into, what is the vision here? Because right now it feels like we're really trying to mitigate symptoms. We're we have this really sick thing here, which is this tree that's rotting from the roots, and we're clipping at the leaves and trying to make it better. But what we really need to do is compost it and grow something else here. But what is that vision? And I think even if you look globally, we have so few examples of what a safe supply market would look like. And that's so far down the road of so many conversations culturally that need to be had, and so many assumptions and ideas and stigmas that need to be peeled back layer by layer, that to say something to an average American voter, imagine if we had a place where people who do use drugs could get a safe supply and know that they're not going to overdose. You have to get through so many, you're speaking a different language at that point. And so it's almost we have to lay out step by step of how we would get from here to there. And I also worry sometimes, what if we get stuck part of the way and think we've done enough? We're okay, Oregon, are we good? Because we've decriminalized these things and we have a therapeutic branch, so we're set, And I think that's a question we always have to be asking. But again, getting past, it's we have to move slow because change is slow, and we're healing our own attitudes and ideas about substances, that this stuff runs so deep. It's so deep. It's going to take generations, whether we like it or not. I do feel the dominoes have been pushed and there are things cascading down, but I don't know. It's almost like we have to tear down what's doing harm before we can build something back that works better for folks. And maybe we have to have a lot of experimental models of what things could look like to actually gather enough data and narrative about how these things are impacting folks. And that takes time. When I talked to Anthony Johnson, he said, we need several years probably before we actually have enough information about the rollout in Oregon to show these impacts and how they're benefiting the community. So we have to have some patience, and we also have to be putting things in motion now and planting seeds so that in a few years, those things are growing, So it's kind of a cascading sort of decentralized movement, it seems like.
Yeah.
Anything that you want to add there?
No, I'm all about that. Like, it's definitely one of the things that, with the decrim versus legalizing, they're two different worlds. They're two different beasts. But these beasts can actually be friends with each other, even though they're from like different species. And that's what we're like definitely on we're the new species right here. That's what we are. And that's why we are like, okay, we love that we have a decrim movement that passed. So now, hey, hopefully the police departments and the law enforcement are upholding these things. Do they have to? Once again, no. I always say to everybody, decrim does not mean legalize. Decrim does not mean you can distribute. Decrim does not mean you still can't go to jail and get arrested for having a single tiny piece of pollen of a little tiny piece of pollen of marijuana, cannabis. Like, you can still go and get in trouble for all of those kind of things. And when we did see some of the abuse happening, some of the icky, gross stuff happening, I feel like at the beginning it was because of the misinformation with decrim versus legalized. And everybody was like, oh my gosh, mushrooms are legal. Still just every day, they're like, oh, mushrooms are legal here in Oregon, aren't they? They're legal. And where can I go and get them? Like, whoa, roll it back. Like, this is why Becca is like creating all these wonderful pieces of information for us, because like it's all about the education. It's still, even though we're talking about all these other things, like our public is still like at step negative, whatever. They're way back there. They still think mushrooms are legal, because decrim means you can just give it away willy-nilly. You can be a massage therapist and like host a integration microdosing class and sell cultures, which is harmful because you can grow a lot of pounds of mushrooms in a really short period of time in your closet. And it's way over the 12 grams that is allowed here as the fruiting. So there's so much things that it's just about the education, and the safety is with the education. So I don't know. I could go on.
No, I really appreciate that. It's such an important point that does often get overlooked. So I did want to highlight it while we had you guys on the show. And yeah, just a quick little shout out to Rebecca's blog post. It is already on our blog. She has a whole explainer on Measure 110 where she interviews Anthony Johnson, has a Q&A with him at the end. It's really fascinating. It really lays out a lot of this information in just a great, easy, digestible way. Just shout out to Rebecca for actually really killing it on our blog lately. Really appreciate all the writing she's been doing for us. It's been so great. It's been a pleasure of mine to edit your work. So yeah, we're coming up to we've passed the hour mark. So I guess if there's any last remarks, any points you guys wanted to make, and then we can, point people into directions of where they can support you and find your work. But anything else you guys wanted to say?
I feel like we covered so much. And of course, we could go on and on and on. But I just definitely want to let people know, like, once again, like, this is a collective. If there's anything, no matter what, that you feel that you could input on to Becca, give to Becca and I, or if you need us to give something back to you, we are only two people, but we try to fit things in where we can. Even though we are busy throughout these next 2 months trying to get this this badass program together, we still know that the community needs us. And that's what's going to make these grueling next 2 years, like, go by so fast, is because we need to continue to get that information. We need to continue to be supported, and because we want to support you guys. And so that's what I'm going to keep saying. And I said that to a girl this weekend. I was like, let me know anything you need. Let us know, because we know people. We're talkers. I know somebody who knows somebody who knows somebody. And so come this way. And then, Becca, do you want to talk a little bit about we have some fundraising goals, and I'd love to talk more about them, although money is something that, is always kind of hard to talk about. We want to talk about it because this is about equity.
This is your chance.
Yeah, this is about equity. So
yeah. Please do.
Totally. Yeah, that's just what I was going to kind of wrap up on, which is we've done a lot of kind of outward facing stuff and really trying to create a lot of free materials for folks, because it's so important to get information out into the average person's hands. In the next, over the summer, we're not going to be as active outwardly. We're going to be finishing season 1 of our podcast and kind of doing some internal work. And a lot of that, the sooner that we can get this push of fundraising done, the sooner we can actually get to work. And it's, again, certain folks don't have these barriers, so they're already getting to work. And I don't say that in terms of competition in any way, but having the ability to know, okay, we're funded, we're able to pay ourselves and our team and our contributors so we can focus on doing excellent work. That's our goal, and we know that's where we're headed. We don't know how long it's going to take us to get there. So we're going to have a whole sponsorship area on our page. So if folks want to sponsor us through the rest of the year, there's lots of ways they can do that. We'll be launching a more formal thing in June. And so there's a contact form on our website at fruitingbodiescollective.com where people, if they have companies or groups or brands or organizations that want to align with us and put their logo on our website and make a contribution, that is warmly welcomed. There's also, if anyone just wants to chip in 10 or 20 bucks, there's an easy way to give now on our website as well. And so we like to always reiterate that whatever comes in, we're going to multiply it. And our goal is that the funding that comes in is generative. So it generates value for the community. It gets redistributed to the people we're trying to uplift, to these amazing leaders, mostly leaders of color, queer, non-binary leaders who are in the space, who are the unsung heroes. They're going to be owners in this project as well. And so it's the money that comes into the Fruiting Bodies, especially right now, is planting seeds. It's sporulating for some really amazing things that are going to be coming out in this ecosystem. So the more people, the more perspectives that are involved, the better. So we just invite people to get in touch. We want to be relational. We move at the pace of trust, which sometimes is slower than folks want in interacting with us. So we appreciate everyone's patience. And I'm sure this won't be our last conversation here. Thanks for having us.
I don't think so.
No, I hope not.
Thank you. And what's your website and social media for people to follow?
Oh,
So it's fruitingbodiescollective.com.
Oh,
you go.
I know, we're all too late. It's Fruiting Bodies. The website is www.fruitingbodiescollective.com. And on social media, same thing, but on Instagram, Fruiting Bodies Co. So without the elective part. And then we do, like Becca said, we have Venmo. We have a few other things that we really, really want you to check out because it's great stuff. Anything else I missed, Becca?
Oh, last thing. There's always last thing. We do have a download on our website. It's a 26-page PDF that summarizes everything you could possibly need to know about Measure 109, short of reading the 80-page measure. So that's on sale right now as well. So if there's folks who just want to track what's going on in Oregon, or if there's listeners who are in Oregon who want to be involved, that's a really valuable resource. So, and yeah, pass it on to folks who are curious.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. This has been wonderful. Really enjoyed it. And yeah, hope to have you both on again soon in the future. It's been wonderful. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.